All right, next we're going to talk about the topic of globalization and how, for the most part, trade makes us wealthier. And I would even say makes all of us wealthier. All right, so globalization. Number one, for a country to be successful with globalization, they have to use their comparative advantage, using the product that they make better than other countries, or what they can do. Whether they can produce it at a lower opportunity cost, or they can just produce a better product for the price. Let's take a look at what that would really look like. So if we're looking at globalization, if we look at countries like China, if we look at countries like Bangladesh, if we look at like a poorer country, what do they have that rich countries don't? Well, they might have resources, so that could give them a comparative advantage. They might have resources like oil, they could have a resource like diamonds, they could have a resource like coal, etc. That's what a poorer country could have. But often what they have is they actually have a comparative advantage because for many of these countries, the cost of labor is cheaper. In China, the cost of labor is much cheaper than it would be in the United States, for example. You can see that if you go to a place like China. Basically, if you look at buying power, what buying power is, it's what you can get for your money. $1 in the United States is worth about $7 in China. Meaning that if you go to China, you don't go to one of the big cities. If you go like to a regular average place in China, and you want to go to a restaurant, you want to buy something, your $1 can get you $7 worth of food in the United States. So you can go to a Chinese restaurant and you can get a huge meal, probably get like an appetizer, meal, dessert, a drink, and you're probably going to spend about like $4 or $5 at most. Where in America, if you did that at a nice restaurant, you're going to at least spend $30, $40. So that's buying power is less in poorer countries. So what we see for a lot of poorer countries, if you wonder why are there factories in other countries, like why are there so many factories in China, it's because the labor cost is cheap and they also have a lot of resources, so China has a comparative advantage right there. Okay, well, let's look at how globalization affects people. Different factories in different places. We see globalization everywhere. We even have Japanese car makers who have factories where they make cars in the United States. So globalization is everywhere. Different companies are all around the world. But they did research, and it was conducted on the national incomes in 1990. And the research showed that for rich countries, these would be rich globalized countries, that their income increased by 2% each year. So when we're talking about rich globalized countries, there's actually not that many of them. When we get to the rich, we're looking mostly at like Japan, Western Europe, England, Britain, France, United States, Australia, and that's about it. Maybe like a Singapore, somewhere like that, but that's about our countries that we consider rich. Then you have some countries which you consider like the middleweights, which would be like, these would be your Russias, your Brazils, Mexico would fall in that category. And then you have your less developed countries underneath there. That's where you would see a lot of countries like a Bolivia would be there. For the most part, a country like India used to be there, but they're kind of there, kind of not now. This is where you'd see like the less developed countries or poorer countries. So right now, the rich countries that are globalized, the rich countries that are doing a lot of international trade, and all the rich countries are doing tons of international trade, they are growing at a rate of 2%. Now let's look at the poor countries. Among the poor globalized countries, these are the poor countries that have decided to open up their borders, allow factories to come in. These are the countries that have globalization going on. The research is showing that they have an increase of income at 5% per year. So their economies are actually growing at 5% per year. These are the ones that open their borders. They don't have the trade barriers. The poorer countries that are less globalized, that are basically have trade barriers, they have tariffs, they're not allowing trade to come in, they are growing at a rate of negative 1%. So your poor countries that are open to trade, growing at 5%. Your countries that are not open to trade, they're growing at negative 1% per year. Now, what we're seeing is there's a big discrepancy, there's a big difference, though, between the rich countries and the poor countries. There's another statistic that almost kind of contradicts this, but it does, but it doesn't. In 1960, so in 1960, if we took like the rich countries and the poor countries, In 1960, the income of the 20 richest countries was 15 times higher than the poorest 20 countries. So we got the 20 richest countries, you got the 20 poorest countries, and it is times 15 in 1960. They're 15 times richer. In today, if we look at that, it is 30 times, so it is doubled. So the richest on top and the poorest in the bottom, it is now times 30. Well, a lot of economists who are pro-globalization, economists who's pro-globalization would say the reason why is because the rich countries are still kind of growing at about a 2% rate, and the poorest countries, many of them are not, they don't have open borders. North Korea does not have open borders, for example, and North Korea is getting poorer. They're not getting richer. So an argument would be made that the globalized poor countries are moving up. Two places where this could be seen would be in India and China. Let's take a look at China, which is averaging about 8% growth. And their goal this year is to average 7.5% growth, which the U.S. would be ecstatic if we had that. All right, so by taking part in globalization, China's been able to modernize its factories, modernize its product, and they've been able to grow. Let's look at some stats here. In 1960, the life expectancy in China was 36. In 1999, 70. Their life expectancy is almost doubled in those almost 40 years. So China has been growing very rapidly, and China would have been one of these poorer countries in 1960, but it's no longer on that chart because it's moved up, and so has India. So let's take a look at some things about globalization. Number one, yes, there are many people who are working at jobs that are that aren't making very much money in poor countries, and a lot of people are making a lot of money off the products. Let's take a designer jacket in New York, might sell for $190. Well, the worker who makes this jacket might get paid 60 cents an hour. Now, that's a big difference, 60 cents an hour for the worker, $190 for the jacket. Doesn't seem fair. And actually, I don't think it is fair. I think the worker should get paid more than that. However, at 60 cents an hour, we might say in America that 60 cents an hour, that's absolutely horrible. But if you went to a country like Bangladesh, 60 cents an hour is above average pay for the average person. And these low wages are what the average worker makes. In fact, when they looked at the study, when they went to Vietnam and they were looking at different factories, they found that the foreign-owned international companies that came into Vietnam, that the pay was not lower than what they could make on average. In fact, in Vietnam, what they found out was that people were making twice the salary or double the salary as the average Vietnamese worker. So if you're working at like a Nike factory in Vietnam, you're making double what the average Vietnamese person is making. So you're doubling their salary by working at a foreign factory. So what they found is that no one is like forced to work in these foreign factories. No one's held at gunpoint, told to come into a factory. And when they started looking at like extra hours that were being given, many of the people who were working extra hours, some of them had to do it to keep their job, but many of them wanted to work the extra hours to make more money. It's kind of like the same principle that many people in the school have parents who are working 10, 12 hours a day, and part of the reason why is because so they can make more money for families here, families back home, and it kind of applies the same thing in many of these poorer countries. People are working more so they can make more money for their family, and many times the families are dependent upon the workers who are working in these foreign companies. Well, let's look at child labor. And child labor is going on in many poor countries where children are working in what are often called sweatshops, long hours. But what we found is that, what's been found is that there's not a lot of schools in these poor countries for the kids to go to. So it's not like if the factory wasn't there, the kids would be going to school. Now, does the factory have some responsibility? Do the foreign companies have responsibility to help these countries? I believe they do, and I believe they should. But it also, what could be said is that it's not like the kids would be going to school if they weren't working in the foreign factory. If the foreign factory went away, they might be trying to work somewhere else. Now, what's generally been a pattern in an article has been seen that child labor generally goes away as globalization increases. For China, there's less child labor now than there was 10, 15, 20 years ago because now wages are starting to go up with the foreign factories coming in. There's competition for jobs and workers. This usually leads to higher wages, and eventually the children are able to leave these jobs and schools can develop. So, right now we can really see is that adults and children in poor countries aren't being forced into hard labor, but it's more of a necessity to survive. In fact, the New York Times magazine article was saying that many times the workers volunteer these extra hours because they need it to make it, and many people in their family, not just them, but extended families, are dependent upon them who end up working in these foreign companies.